Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, Terminal Solstice, Sean Minogue's book out via Turnstone Press, a fascinating piece of sci-fi, and he's here to talk about it. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So where I want to start with this is, where did you start with this? Like, was there a kernel of an idea? Did you have like something you were wrestling with, or a character that kind of birthed this? How did this all start?
Yeah, I mean, like the idea at the core of the book when it comes to this frozen time phenomenon, that's something that I thought of like as a teenager, not as a story concept, but as more like a kind of like a way to escape reality. Like, wouldn't it be nice if I could have this magical power kind of thing? And then I never thought about it again. Like it just kind of was stuck in the ether. And then, when about like 2014, I was really hungry to do some kind of writing for myself. And I thought about writing a book, and I thought, what kind of concept do I have a lot to say about? And this frozen time phenomenon came back from my youth, and I really tried to just go for it and structure a story around that possibility, and then use like a thriller structure as a way to tell that story.
So it was initially like a flight of fancy as a teenager, being like, oh, what if I could be unstuck from time and everything else stood still?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that why some of the POV characters are youths, like that they're teenagers or young people?
Yeah, I mean, like, so, for people who haven't read the story yet, there's three main characters, and one of them is a teenager, but there are other characters reflecting on their youth within, that being affected by this frozen time phenomenon. And yeah, for sure, I was channeling, especially with the character Tyler, I was channeling a lot of how I felt as a teenager, where, I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie in Northern Ontario, and um, as kind of like a naive, innocent kid who was creative and like seeking a way to find my way through the world. And I feel like a lot of that was, mostly unconsciously like imbued into Tyler, but there was some stuff that I was actually drawing upon that I really wanted to include in the book as well.
How did you land on having three POV characters, Len and Emma and Tyler?
There was so much I wanted to say. Like there was once I kind of tapped into this central phenomenon as like a backdrop for the story, then that really influenced, what would be happening to these characters. And, some of them were, I had a clear vision for what I wanted to do with Tyler right from the start. And he and Emma really had a clear bond that I was, super confident about. It was Len that, who really surprised me along the way. He initially was a much more antagonistic force. And then the more I was trying to, humanize him, the more I realized that I kind of love him, and I kind of like the schlubbiness of him. And so that character really came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden I had this cast of three. And then so a big challenge of the rewrites was figuring out that narrative, like baton passing between the three of them, to make sure that there's a coherent narrative, there's a feeling of like propulsion from one episode to the next. And it took a little while to get that flow, but I'm really happy with how the three of them play together.
Figuring out that propulsion, is that because you'd kind of decided this is going to be a thriller style book?
Yeah, I mean, like the thriller thing really, and for readers of like traditional thrillers, this is probably a different mode than that. It really floats in that speculative fiction space for sure, because of the high concept of frozen time. But like I didn't really think about genre too much until I was in the revision mode, like towards the end, because then I realized like what kind of meal I'd made for myself. And I'm like, the book was telling me that it wanted to move at a certain pace. Like it was a very unconscious process for me. I was just like, oh, okay, that's what you want? You want a faster pace in this chapter? Sure, I can speed it up there and then see where that energy carries me.
You mentioned, figuring out the baton passing, and how, like in the revisions, do you figure out where one person's story ends and the next person picks up the baton? Like what is it apparent to you, or are you trying to like figure out like a way to kind of like reverse engineer how someone gets from point A to point B in the story?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's a geography, a mental, creative geography considerations where you're trying to get someone from this spot in the world that you've created over to another spot, and then that's you've kind of like created a bit of structure there. But like for the baton passing, it's honestly that sometimes it made total sense. You draft a chapter and you're just like, oh, awesome work, and you pat yourself on the back and you think how great it is to be a writer. And then other times I was just like, where the heck is this chapter going? How do I get to a point of not like full resolution, but to satisfy the goals of that chapter? And that's where I really had to kind of like put on my thinking cap to figure out what am I trying to say about this particular episode that a character is grappling with, and how do I move them forward? And sometimes I got it right, sometimes I didn't, and when I didn't, that's where I could feel it, and I could feel where the energy was in some chapters. Or it was just like it totally felt like that's what I'm going for this whole time. And if I can just replicate that or find a way to tease that out in another character when they're going through something else in another chapter, then I know that I'm doing my job. And so like that was really the goal of the revision. It was to maintain that energy, making me feel confident that like I've done what I was aiming to do with each baton passing moment.
You mentioned the goals of a chapter. Is that something you're conscious of as you're writing, like what the purpose of a specific chapter is?
No, not at all. Like, I mean, maybe I should be, but I wasn't like thinking specifically about like, okay, in this chapter I have to do X, Y, or Z. The Because of the way I wrote this project, I became like I started it so long ago, and then I kind of had to drop it because parenting took over my life, and I just had these little snippets of time. And so all I was trying to do in those little snippets was just like keep it moving forward, write one more sentence, keep going, keep going, keep going. Which any parents listening will know that that's impossible at some points. And so yeah, it's always been tricky to make that work. But like I'm lucky that I have a really supportive wife and family who are all like cheerleading me along. So it's been good.
Speaking of parenting, Emma is pregnant in parts
Mhm.
of this. Was that like did was that concurrent with your own parenting that like she became a parent as a character or was going to be a parent?
I started thinking about this recently about like chicken or the egg, where where that pregnancy thing came from, and I I went back to like the first draft where I was just throwing everything I could at the wall, and there was some images that were so clear to me. Whether when it came to like frozen time, I knew what the frozen time phenomenon felt like for the characters, and it was just a matter of articulating what that should feel like to readers who are actually reading those passages. And when I was making those early assumptions about like the book is this and not that, um, some of those images were I always had a teenager like Tyler who had a friendship with a young mother to be in Emma, and I always had that clear vision of those two kind of navigating this frozen world in like a Toronto-like landscape. And it was just a matter of trying to figure out like a story structure for how they can come together, what tries to pull them apart, and that kind of thing. But yeah, so Emma was always in my mind. She was always going to be pregnant, but it was just a matter of figuring out how and why like what how does that affect her character. And then once my wife and I, once our family was growing, um it was witnessing all the changes that she was going through, and the physical challenges that was just like something incredible to for someone like myself to witness and to take that not intentionally, but kind of when you're writing about a character and then you're witnessing in real life, there's definitely some crossover. So my wife got a kick out of reading that part of the book too, for sure.
So when you're describing some of the action Emma's involved with as a pregnant woman, was she kind of like, the reader over your shoulder being like, not buying
No,
it?
what's funny is that like I because we were so busy in those like early years of my youngest son's life, when he had colic, he was keeping us up all night, and there was no way I could have like a regular writing life. And the idea that I would pass a draft of what I was working on to my wife for something for her to have to read and get back to me. There was just no time to do any of that. So like I was often writing this in like a little silo of like a bit of free time here and there. And it was only when the manuscript had been developed for a certain amount of time that that we started talking about it more. And so I would like be sharing a little bit of information. And then so when she started reading it before, it got too far with Turnstone, then she could kind of like recognize some of those moments from our life for sure.
Right. I was curious to hear you mention, a Toronto-like setting, because I was curious if this was like specifically like if you thought of a place or if you imagined a place, and it sounds like, because obviously like there's action that happens within a certain geography, right? And so I was curious about like how much you plotted out kind of what world these people were inhabiting, not just a world where this time stoppage happens, but like the physicality of what they have to do happens.
Yeah, there was there was some debate in my mind, and also like during the editing process about like should I just say this is Toronto? I don't anywhere in the book, and I don't think it really matters whether the reader thinks it is Toronto or not. I think if you're living in the city, and you hear references, there's a significant number of scenes that happen within like the Sky Dome, right? That's at least what I imagine in my head, because I've had memorable experiences in that place, and I don't have a ton of experiences in other baseball stadiums. But the reason why I didn't like just name it as Toronto and call it out is because I wanted to mess around with the geography a little bit, and I didn't want a reader who knew the city really, really well to be like, actually, that you couldn't walk from the Sky Dome in order to get to X, Y, or Z place. And, I didn't want that reality to seep into this fictional landscape. And so I played around with the geography a bit, just to serve the story. And I felt like if you're going to think it's Toronto, great. If you don't think it's Toronto, or you're living on the other side of the world and you're reading this in a totally different context, I don't think it really matters too much. But yeah, it's like an extra bit of flavor if you know it.
It frees you from a world of like kind of nitpicky like geography questions.
Exactly. Yeah.
So as far as the time stoppage, I'm curious because, like you said, you developed this idea as a teenager, then you kind of returned to it in 2014. But like to me, it felt like there was some stuff being addressed about like kind of when the world shut down during COVID, like in rewrites, like was that something that kind of got brought in, or is it just one of those things where sometimes things line up and you're kind of addressing something where like reality is suspended or it lines up with something that has been in the ether?
It's both. When the pandemic hit, it freaked me out, specifically, not just because of the reason why everyone else was kind of freaked out at the time, but because I was working on a book about like global chaos from this strange phenomenon that no one understands and no one knows how to cope with it. That is like basically that feeling is what drove me to get back into the manuscript and really keep working at the book, because until that point I was just so busy with life and it was just really hard to find that writing time. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and there's all this uncertainty, and there a couple of years into it you start getting a lot of that social fabric kind of fraying a bit. Like 2021 I remember as a really grumpy year for a lot of people, and I feel like that is the feeling that it's not like I was anticipating it exactly, but like that was the feeling that I wanted for the landscape. Because in the book that I've written, it's Terminal Solstice is like built on this world where the authority figures don't have an answer. They don't know how to ameliorate the worst effects of this phenomenon they don't understand. And that's what I started to see a bit in those early COVID days, where like everyone was really uncertain of themselves. They were really doubting well, not everyone, but like there was a segment of society that was really doubting the guidance from our official authorities. And I feel like within that space, that's where a lot of the kind of more conspiracy minded people kind of come out of the woodwork and start generating a lot of support for antisocial ideas, as fascinating as they are, but like they grow out of that vacuum of leadership. And what COVID did was just give a really tangible reference point for me to speak to the reader. The reader, I could then more easily assume, had the same mental real estate that I had when we're talking about a shared global crisis. And so, if anything, it allowed me to do a lot more shorthand when talking about a global crisis. But a big chunk of that stuff was already in the book. And then so when the pandemic hit, I was like, oh no, oh no, I gotta hurry up, because everyone's gonna be writing their pandemic novel, and Station 11 comes out, and I'm sure she was working on that well before. I'm talking about Emily St. John Mandel. I'm sure she was working on Station 11 well before the pandemic hit, and I think there's something in the ether when you can feel the cracks happening in society. uh, there's just a writer's choice to figure out how to explore that and make it a narratively interesting.
I'm glad you brought up the conspiracy angle too, because that was the other part that felt like really contemporary. And knowing kind of how long a book can take, and even not necessarily knowing that you started in 2014, but even, assuming like 2 or 3 years at least for something to land at this point felt like, oh, wow, this really is tapped into kind of what's going on in terms of this distrust of government, or like that people are lying to you, and like kind of a fervor of cult that forms around kind of oppositional thinking. So it sounds like this allowed you to kind of maybe shorthand some of that, or at least not have to like explore it as deeply because it's already happening in the world.
Yeah, I mean like I grew up, like I was a teenager in the 90s, and I kind of came of age in the early 2000s, and uh, the conspiracy thinking and conspiracy theories, especially in the wake of September 11th, that they existed then, right? It was just wasn't mainstreamed, and so I feel like there was always this kind of like chatter that you can think it's crazy, but it's also like kind of interesting to hear people come up with their theories on how they understand the world. Like one of my favorite movies to watch every once in a while is Richard Linklater's Slacker, and that's a very Gen Xer kind of like just letting conspiracy theorists have monologues about how they understand the world and what's coming next and all that kind of stuff. And it seems so quaint and you know like non-threatening in that context from 20, 30 years ago. But you can really see how the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories and the distrust of public authorities really tears apart society once there is an avenue through, like, social media, for example. The internet has really allowed for this to happen, but I don't think any of it really happens without there being a leadership vacuum. And so a part of my approach with writing Terminal Solstice is not saying that the people who believe in these conspiracy theories within Terminal Solstice, like the whole Lola phenomenon, this like spaceship that a lot of people are hinging their hopes on, explaining the phenomenon. I just didn't want to feel like I was talking down to people who believe that stuff, because I feel like it all starts at like this seed of truth that then gets misinterpreted and kind of like bent to serve someone's point of view, and that's where like you get like the real problems of misinformation. But I feel like we can meet a lot of the folks who believe in these things. We can meet them in the middle and kind of say like, yeah, you're right, that there are powerful forces that are shaping our world. There, Elon Musk is becoming a trillionaire, and like how insane that is, and that we can make policies to solve these problems, and we're not doing it, and we're kind of like enabling a lot of these problems to fester. And in that absence of leadership, and absence of solutions and policies that can really help the ordinary person, where those things aren't happening. And so those ordinary folks are they seek out some appeal in the really a lot more simplistic theories for how the world works or should work or whatever.
That brings me to the character of Robert Boyle.
Mm-hmm.
Who obviously is kind of, there's a kernel of like believability and truth to kind of like what he believes in, but he's a huckster too. And
Yep.
and so you talked about like that power vacuum and allowing people to kind of like fill it with their own purposes, and he does that. And was that like, did you have someone in mind, or how did you develop the character of Robert and kind of crystallize kind of what his role would be in this?
Yeah, I didn't really. I've never been interested in like the mustache twirling villain who has a clear idea of what they want to do with all the power that they're accumulating. I think it's a lot more human and humane, empathetic to see someone who is grasping for power, and see that as like a personal failing that they're trying to address. So there's no mention of Trump and or like Trumpism or anything like that in this book because like you said, like this book kind of predated, or the start of this book predated the advent of Trumpism, right? It was 2014 when we're still in the Obama era, and the Harper era, so much, well, not just about Justin Trudeau, um, and yeah, I feel like it's been so easy to like see someone like Trump and then kind of like see that kind of narcissism into a story. But like the way I was going about it is like seeing him as a huckster who is out for his own vanity, who does believe what he's saying. He gets high on his own supply, when it comes to conspiracy theories. But his end goal is always about himself. He's just looking for a way to maintain his relevance in a fractured world, and the only way he can do that is like for the other side, the official side, to kind of keep falling on its face, and that just allows for him to keep maintaining his cult-like status. And I think our obsession with celebrity really enables people in the real world to do very similar things.
Yeah, you have Emma say to Tyler at one point, I think he has a way of making angry people feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that, basically says, there are people who make promises, they break those promises, and then people get further angry. And then your dad comes along with an explanation that allows them, that anger and a source for it. And as you said, this predates Trump, but like that putting your faith in someone who allows you to kind of like rail against a system again feels like very current, right? In the same way that the conspiracy stuff and the like paused time seem to have
Yeah.
hit, it
Yeah.
really seems to speak to a moment.
Yeah, and it's like I feel that whenever there's a politician of any political level or whatever, any party, um coming so close to the point, where they're addressing something that really makes me frustrated with the world as it is, and then they don't address it. It drives me crazy, and I just wish people could have some real talk. That's what I think. Zoran Mamdani, who just won the he's the mayor elect in New York, and that incredible campaign that he just had. He's just like so focused, so transparently real with people, and I feel like that really resonates. And we've got a lot of work to do on the Canadian side of things to make that transparency a core part of the public discourse. And that I just feel like I've got a lot of empathy for people who get pissed off about seeing the world kind of continue to limp onward in this status quo way, rather than addressing some of the core sources of a lot of our discontent.
Speaking of limping along in the status quo way, that's Len's problem, at least the way his ex sees it, right? That she leaves him because she feels he's never going to change. She points out he still has the same haircut many years later. That this is a guy who is unchanging, and yet in some ways he's one of the more sympathetic characters in this book.
Yeah, well, let me just say, Michael, thank you for reading the book. I can feel it in your questions, and I really appreciate that. It really makes me feel like you got it, you paid attention to it, and you're thinking about it. So I really appreciate that, man. But yeah, I agree. Like Len is in many ways a really core part of like the heart that I feel in the book. I love his kind of like schlubby G shucks kind of like approach to life, but also this kind of gritty, get her done kind of blue collar thing. Uh, and I just love that aspect of him. But when you were mentioning that like he is kind of stuck in that, not really progressing past a certain point in his life, I feel like all three of the characters, in their different ways, embody this like frozen time as like a developmental pause in their life, right? Like Emma can't get over the trauma that she experienced when she was having her first experience with frozen time. That's when we first meet her in the book. And Tyler is also having this kind of like developmental pause as well. He's just at that like verge of like choosing his path, through quote unquote manhood. And so all of them are at this point where they really need to be forced over the line, and it's just following them through this story to see whether they're going to go one way or the other, to become fuller versions of themselves or the next iteration of themselves.
So did you conceive of trajectories for each of them from the hop, or was that something where writing the story suggested where they would end up?
Yeah, writing the story really is what kind of pulled me towards, what their journey was. And I think early on, I didn't know what that was. Like when I was doing those early drafts, before parenting kind of like annihilated my free time, I would dictate to the characters, like, this is going to be your journey. And they would say, no, it's not. And I'd say, yeah, I think I know. Yeah, that's your journey. And I would really try to, control the story more so than was necessary. And then, it was only through like developing the story again after I had a more stable schedule and could revisit the manuscript and really develop a rhythm of rewriting it, that the characters were speaking back to me, and they were telling me that no, I was wrong, I have to take them in this direction, and that they wanted to go on these various pathways. So yeah, I had intentions at the start. They fell flat, and then the characters corrected me, so it worked out.
How are you able to do that as a writer, to be open to like, oh, I was wrong about what I thought this was, and I need to course correct?
It's like stubbornly against it until you can't deny it anymore, because I'm like so convinced that that I'm right about something, and I feel like you got to have that. You have to have a certain level of decisive certainty about the story that you're telling, because no one else is going to tell it. No one cares whether you tell it the way you're going to tell it or not, because it's not a book yet. So I feel like that you have to have a bit of that, shoot from the hip certainty that when you're writing your own book. But it's at a certain point, it becomes really obvious when you don't feel the energy in a chapter or a passage, or an outcome for a character. You're just like, something's missing. I know something's missing, and it's just a matter of like, having a sit down, take yourself out to the woodshed to kind of like consider, like, you really need to have that hard conversation about which character needs the most attention, which chapter might not have to be there anymore. And that's a difficult process. That sucks. That's like you're chopping away something that took hours and hours and hours to build, and then you realize it doesn't have a place anymore. But I feel like that's the process or that's the difference between having a manuscript and a book. You got to make those choices in order to make it a book. And yeah, it sucks, but it's necessary.
Well, that might have been a hard conversation. I hope this wasn't. The book is Terminal Solstice, out through Ravenstone. Sean, thanks very much for joining me on the program.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.